I've done been really lucky to have done a series of books with Chomsky, and working with him over the years, I've really been struck by his consistency, his patience, and equanimity. And in terms of his intellectual chops, he's awesome in his syncretic ability to take a wide and disparate amount of information and cobble it into a coherent analysis. And like the Dorje thunderbolt of Tibetan Buddhism, Chomsky, with relentless logic, peels away and devastates the layers of deceit and deception produced by the embedded journalists of the corporate media and the mandarins of state power and American empire. Always, he reminds us, as he did this afternoon on the lawn of the Boulder Public Library, addressing a large gathering there, that the responsibility is up to us. We, the citizens, really must change the society and culture if we want to see a world of peace and social justice and democracy in this country. Earlier, David Horowitz. But Chomsky does have his critics, and one must acknowledge them, and one of the leading critics is someone named David Horowitz. He wrote an article called The Sick Mind of Noam Chomsky. And this is not untypical of the kind of vitriol and loathing that is directed toward this incredibly mild-mannered and self-effacing man. This is what Horowitz says. You know, we have to do like good journalists, ping-pong journalists, the good and the bad. Okay. His venomous message is spread on tapes and CDs and the lecture circuit. Chomsky's influence is best understood not that as of a intellectual figure, but as the leader of a secular religious cult, as the Ayatollah of anti-American hate. This guy's deep. This guy's deep. This cultic resonance is recognized by his followers. His most important devotee, David Barsamyan, is an obscure public radio producer on KGNU in Boulder, Colorado, who has created a library of Chomsky screeds on tape. All right. Fair and balanced. We report, you decide. Well, Chomsky at 74 is indefatigable. He spoke last night before thousands in Denver. He's leaving early in the morning to give 2 talks in Los Angeles. He is, as Bono of U2 once called him, a rebel without a pause. And he draws huge audiences wherever he goes, and he's literally booked years in advance. As he once told me, I'm not a charismatic speaker, and if I had the capacity to do so, I wouldn't use it. I'm really not interested in persuading people. What I like to do is help people persuade themselves. Often Chomsky is introduced as someone who exemplifies the Quaker adage of speaking truth to power. He actually takes exception to that. He says the powerful already know what's going on. It's the people who need to hear the truth. And now, celebrating 25 years of KGNU, please welcome Noam Chomsky.
One of the things I've learned from many years of not being a charismatic speaker is that my voice doesn't carry very well. So tell me if you can hear me before I... Okay? Yeah. We're all aware that right at this moment, bodies are being torn to shreds by infernal weapons. Unknown numbers of people who have already been driven to the edge of survival by a decade of murderous sanctions, may be facing starvation and slow death. Under these circumstances, it's not very easy to step back and try to ask why all this is happening, where it's likely to go, and what we can do to shape the future. But that's what I want to try to do. About the last question, what we can do to shape the future, the answer is straightforward, quite a lot. In fact, there's no one anywhere who can do as much as we can. We're uniquely privileged. We have unusual freedom. That's not a gift from on high. It's a legacy that was won by centuries of constant, dedicated struggle, and that's really the answer to what we can do. Pay attention to the legacy and carry it forward. Privilege and advantages confer responsibility. That's should be truism. What comes next is hard, though. Personal choices. One choice is to face the responsibility. Not easy, though a lot easier than it is in other countries, other places not as privileged as we are. The other choice is to shirk the responsibility and hand the future over to be determined by forces that we can be sure are not benign. Well, many people in the world, probably the vast majority as far as we know, are hoping, and probably desperately hoping, that we will make the first choice, face the responsibility. And they view with dread the consequences if we do not act to control what they see as a juggernaut that's they regard as the greatest threat to peace in the world. And these days, threat to peace means literally threat to survival. Well, not everyone is dismayed. So take Osama bin Laden. If he's alive somewhere, I'm sure he's enjoying mightily the scenes that are portrayed in one way on television here and in a different way by correspondents and commentators who are not embedded within the invading system. He's made it very clear what he wants. He wants a war to the death between the evil empire and the billions of people around the world, and that's what he's getting. The political, even before the invasion of Iraq, the U.S. political leadership had inspired extraordinary level of fear throughout the world, not just the Arab and the Muslim world. Since the invasion, the war that the world is seeing, not the one being portrayed here, that war has aroused a wave of revulsion that's actually becoming a serious concern even to policymakers here, and it's reaching the mainstream press. So just in the last few days, the mainstream press has been publishing lead articles about it. They report, give you some quotes, a growing hatred of America, regarded as a violent aggressor, a cruel aggressor that's relying on overwhelming force to crush anyone who's in its way, and worse still, it seems to be rejoicing in its ability to destroy a defenseless enemy, people shooting with rusting rifles at tanks and bombers. The rejoicing over that is not inspiring great love around the world. Furthermore, Saddam Hussein has been transformed by the invasion. He was regarded as a thug and a despot and hated, and he's becoming a hero. A brave, I'm quoting again, a brave and noble man. His praises gush from the lips of Arabs from nearly every walk of life. I was quoting long experienced American reporters in Jordan in this case. The director of the Center for Strategic Studies in Jordan says that without doubt Saddam now occupies the high moral ground across the Arab world, and he finds that very disturbing. Thinks it's going to cause huge problems for countries like Jordan and Egypt, especially if there's any step towards democratization, because if the voice of the people is heard, he knows what voice it's going to be. It's going to be the voice of radical Islamists who are calling for a war against America, and also secular nationalists who despise Saddam Hussein but now admire him because he's standing up to the savage Americans and no one else is. And in death, he's likely to become an even greater hero. There have been polls recently taken by American academics of the Arab world. And what they find is also a cause for a lot of concern. A huge majority from all over, from Morocco to the Gulf states and Lebanon, a huge majority want Islamic clergy to play a greater role in government. About 95% are convinced that the United States has no interest in the region beyond maintaining control over its oil. And incidentally, those concerns go back 50 years. That was the reason for what President Eisenhower called a campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world back in the late 1950s. Nothing new about it. They're convinced now, too, that the U.S. has no interest, and he, incidentally, and his staff concluded that that was correct. That is their interest. And they were supporting oppressive and governments and preventing development because of the interest in maintaining control over Middle East oil. That's the 1950s, not today. Now, 95% are convinced that that's still the interest, along with protecting Israeli power and humiliating Arabs and Muslims, or anybody who's in the way, relying on the fact that they have an overwhelming monopoly of violence. By now, they even speak of Saddam Hussein with reverence, even though they hate him as a murderous tyrant. Well, one recent story, and the big long story in the Washington Post about all this, opens by saying something ominous is brewing that does not portend well for the United States. And that's an understatement. It does not. That's quite an achievement by George W. Bush and his associates. These discussions are referring to the Arab and the Muslim world. Actually, that's the world that they claim to be liberating. In fact, it extends far beyond. It seems to be worldwide. It's not the last few days, though it's gotten much more extreme. If somebody was watching all of this from outer space, they might be led to believe that George Bush was embedded in the White House as an agent of Osama bin Laden. He's certainly acting that way. Well, you know, we can... unfortunately, it's not a joke. It does not portend well. The consequences could be very grim. Well, we got choices on this, too. We can decide to live in a cocoon, the cocoon that's created by television and embedded commentators. We can admire ourselves for our magnificence, or we can look at what the world thinks and ask why. People have to decide for themselves what's the wisest and most admirable course. I don't think it's a hard decision. Well, as I said, going back, we can go the fear of the United States, of its leadership, particularly this political leadership, although it actually goes beyond. That goes back well before the invasion of Iraq. It was bad before, but within a year, Bush and his advisors have turned the United States into a pariah state. It's greatly feared throughout the world. It's regarded as the greatest threat to world peace by substantial majorities. Back as last October, the national press was forced to recognize, I'm quoting, that the world is more concerned about the unbridled use of American power than they are about the threat of Saddam Hussein. Actually, that's an understatement. No matter how much the world hates Saddam Hussein, it's only in the United States that he's feared. No one else regarded him as a threat, including his neighbors. They hate him, but they're not afraid of him. That's a special U.S. property. That's reached the point where the fear and concern over U.S. power has been featured in the national media recently, cover stories in Newsweek and the Washington Post recently. There's one of the major polling centers, the research centers, is the Pew Center, Pew Research Center, recently published a poll on the image of the United States around the world, Europe mainly. It's plummeted. It's particularly Bush and his associates. Most places it's still dissociated from the country, though there are some exceptions like Poland and Turkey where the country is feared and hated. But it'll follow. If they keep at it, it'll follow. It'll be not them, but everyone. The head of the non-aligned movement, that's governments of roughly 80% of the world's population, former colonies basically, Prime Minister Mahathir of Malaysia, who's very pro-American, very much part of the whole U.S. international economic project, what's absurdly called globalization. He recently said that the United States today, under the current leadership, is more dangerous to the world than Hitler. That wasn't reported here. We want to stay in a cocoon, but it was reported elsewhere, like England. You want to get out of the cocoon, you should know that. Well, you look beyond, it gets, in some ways, even more remarkable. You all know, I'm sure, that every year the World Economic Forum has a meeting usually in Davos, Switzerland. It's usually very upbeat and enthusiastic. Not this year. This year there was an atmosphere of what the press called gloom. The theme of the meeting last January was building trust. And the reason for that was that the World Economic Forum had just done a poll which they'd released about trust in leadership around the world, and they'd found a sharp decline in trust. There was only one, they had various categories. The only category that had even a majority of, a slight majority of the population trusting them was non-governmental organizations. Right below them came the UN and spiritual and religious leaders. Below them were Western European leaders. Keep going down, you get the corporate managers. The very bottom, leaders of the United States. It's pretty amazing. Colin Powell was sent there by the administration as their emissary. He had a very rough time. He was bitterly condemned. The focus of the meeting was the coming war with Iraq, which they were strongly opposed to, and they weren't by no means impressed with Powell's proclamation that the U.S. Declares the sovereign right to use force as it wishes. It's going to lead, even if nobody's following. Didn't win a lot of hearts and minds. This, remember, is the core of the international establishment. These are the people who the business press calls the masters of the universe. It includes corporate executives who are paying $30,000 each to attend, and major figures everywhere. That kind of opposition to government policy is completely without precedent. And it extends right to the United States, at the heart of the elite opposition to the political leadership is, again, extraordinary. The major foreign affairs journals, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and others. Popular opposition also has absolutely no precedent. There was an international Gallup poll. It wasn't reported here. Again, preference for the cocoon last December. The results were pretty interesting. We'll run through them, but just one result, one question asked had to do with the war that Bush and Blair and Powell and the rest are declaring and are now carrying out, a war that they carry out without any calling themselves the Allies, but they're allied only in the sense that they're allied against almost universal world opinion. The coalition forces, as the propaganda system calls them. A war carried out by them didn't even barely reach 10% support in any of the countries polled. The opposition in Europe was greatest in the countries that were where the leadership was lining up with Washington over the overwhelming opposition of their own population. That's incidentally being lauded here in a demonstration of hatred and contempt for democracy that also has no precedent. David was making jokes about France, but the reason for why France and Germany are so reviled is that the governments are taking the position of the overwhelming majority of the population. And that's considered a crime. It's a pretty striking fact. The governments that are praised, what Rumsfeld calls the New Europe, they're countries where the leadership is taking their orders from Crawford, Texas, and disregarding, 90% of the population. Those are the good guys. Now, what this tells you about the attitude towards democracy among elites here is pretty astonishing. Don't have to comment on it. I'm sure you noticed that the biggest demonstrations by far in mid-February, were in the countries where the leadership was going along with the United States, Italy and Spain. Same figures are same right through Eastern Europe. So Hungary, for example, has also about 80 or 90% opposition to the war under any circumstances. And the Latin America, of course, overwhelming opposition. There's always overwhelming opposition there to U.S. military intervention, which they've had a little bit of experience with. When the Allies had to have their summit meeting, in which they presented an ultimatum to the United Nations, and not to Iraq. They presented an ultimatum to the United Nations, Bush, Blair, Aznar, saying, you follow us in 24 hours or else. Where did they meet? Well, they couldn't meet in any country where there are people around. That's too dangerous. They met in a U.S. military base on an island. That's where you gotta meet, like the World Trade Organization, which had to meet in Doha to make sure there's no demonstrations, be surrounded by navies. That tells you a lot. Well, it's a real achievement, and you really have to ask how, let's say you're this Martian observer, how did Bush and his associates manage to make themselves the most feared and hated political leadership in the world, in fact, maybe ever, shaming the country and ultimately endangering its people? How'd they do it? Well, you look back, you can see how they did it. Just without running through the whole story, just start last September, because there was a big change then. Last September, a lot of important things happened, and they made an effect on world and U.S. opinion. The first and most important was the declaration in late September of the National Security Strategy. Immediately and surprisingly, it was harshly criticized in the main establishment international affairs journal, Foreign Affairs, Council on Foreign Relations, which they do it in sort of muted terms, but you could see the concern. It was called an Imperial Grand Vision. The government announced a pretty remarkable doctrine. Basically, what it came down to is that the U.S. is going to rule the world by force, That's the dimension in which it has overwhelming dominance. The U.S. probably outspends the rest of the world combined in military force by now. It's going to rule the world by force, and it's going to do it indefinitely. If the U.S. government perceives any potential challenge to its domination of the world, it's going to destroy it. That's the doctrine that was announced. It's usually in the press, it's called a doctrine of preemptive war. That's not what they announced. A preemptive war has a meaning. It means that if you're under attack, you're under imminent threat of attack, like, remember back in 1983, the Russians were going to bomb us from an air base in Grenada. Well, okay, say the Russian planes are in Grenada and they're flying to Florida about to bomb us, then a preemptive war would mean you're allowed to shoot them down before they bomb, and maybe even bomb the threatening air base in Grenada. That's preemptive war. It has to be an imminent attack that's taking place. That's not what was proposed in September. What was proposed is that they can attack anybody they decide to call a potential threat. Sometimes that's called preventive war, but even that's not fair because they're allowed to invent the threat. It's not preventing anything necessarily. That's the doctrine that was announced. The goal, to quote somebody else, was to use force to prevent any challenge to the power, position, and prestige of the United States. And no legal issue arises if the U.S. acts to prevent any such challenge. That's now the position of the rulers of the country that outspends probably the rest of the world combined in means of violence, or close to that. And it's now forging new and very dangerous paths over near unanimous world opposition. Most striking and dangerous of them is the development of lethal weaponry in space, which really does pose a threat to survival of the species. Well, I mentioned I was quoting someone else, and it's important who it was. It was Denis Acheson, a respected elder statesman, senior advisor of the Kennedy administration. That's what he said in 1963, right after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which almost led to terminal nuclear war. The roots of the missile crisis were a campaign of international terrorism that the Kennedy administration was carrying out again in order to carry out what's now called regime change in Cuba. And we know why. Part of the freedom that we've obtained, if we want to use it, is that we have unusual access to internal secret government documents. They get declassified. There's thousands of pages of them on this. We can choose to ignore them if we want, or we can look. And if we look, we find that the reasons for the campaign of international terrorism were that the very existence of the Castro government is a successful challenge to U.S. policies that go back 150 years. What does that mean? Well, it's 150 years of U.S. policy saying you follow our orders or else. And the existence of that regime was successful defiance of that. Furthermore, it was regarded as a threat because of the possible spread of the Castro idea of taking matters into your own hands, which has great appeal to people in the region who suffer from similar forms of oppression. We got to stop that. 150 years of policy tell us that. Well, that was the reason for the international terrorist campaign, led right to the missile crisis, almost nuclear war, just learned how close it was. After the crisis was over, the terrorist campaign was renewed, along with economic strangulation, and right at that point, Denis Acheson informed the American Society of International Law that no legal issue arises in the case of a U.S. response to a challenge to its power, position, or prestige. Well, that's approximately the Bush doctrine of September 1992. This is the opposite end of the political spectrum, remember. And that's important to know. We want to understand ourselves, remember what the political spectrum is. Well, why the shudders around the world and the foreign policy elite here in September, last September? Well, there's a reason. Acheson was describing policy, and it's true, that is policy. It's been so for a long time. But the national security strategy last September proclaimed it as official policy, and that's quite a difference, an important one. Actually, you want to think about this. It goes back beyond that. You can find the policy described in the early stages of the Second World War, actually before the U.S. even entered it. There you can find a clear announced discussion of what's now called the Imperial Grand Strategy. So even before the U.S. entered the war, there were study groups of high-level planners from the Council on Foreign Relations, kind of the foreign policy elite, and the State Department trying to decide what to do in the post-war world. And they concluded that in the post-war world, the United States must hold, I'm quoting it now, must hold unquestioned power and must act to ensure limitation of any exercise of sovereignty by states that interfere with U.S. global designs. That's the September National Security Strategy. And they also recognized that the foremost requirement to secure these ends is rapid fulfillment of a program of complete rearmament. That's a central component of an integrated policy to achieve military and economic supremacy for the United States. That's 1940. At that time, those ambitions were limited to what they called the non-German world. They expected that Germany might win the European war, at least. And the non-German world was going to be organized under the United States rule as what they called a grand area that included the Western Hemisphere, the former British Empire, and the Far East. Well, shortly after that, Russia beat back the Nazi armies at Stalingrad, and it became fairly clear that Germany would ultimately be defeated, and these plans were then extended to include as much of Eurasia as possible, and they were implemented after the Second World War. They've been described since, as in Dean Acheson's comment, and now they're official policy. Well, that's all important to know. In a society that really valued its freedom, I wouldn't have to be saying this. Everybody would have learned it in high school. These are really important things to know about ourselves. There's plenty more like it. Well, let's go back to last September. One important development, which did cause plenty of concern around the world, foreign policy elite here, was the proclamation of the national security strategy. Something else happened in September. September was the opening of the political campaign for the midterm elections. And that was combined with an enormous propaganda campaign which began to present Iraq, Saddam Hussein, as an imminent threat to the survival of the United States, with insinuations that Iraq was responsible for the September 11th attacks. Actually, if you look at this morning's New York Times, Karl Rove, who's George Bush's minder, as they call him in Iraq, he describes it this morning. He says the goal is that in order to pursue the domestic agenda of the administration, it's necessary to frighten the population. You have to make the population feel that they have to shelter under, behind the powerful leader who's going to save them from destruction. You can do that. You can pursue your domestic agenda. Otherwise, not. He's talking about what we have to do what they're going to have to do in the future. But he also says, yeah, that's what they did in the past, and that's correct. In September, Condoleezza Rice showed up with her prediction that the next thing we're going to hear about Saddam Hussein is a mushroom cloud. They're planning to destroy us. And then there came a series of outlandish lies repeated passionately by Bush and others, distributed quite uncritically by the media, and it had an immediate effect. You take a look at polls by September, after this campaign began, roughly 60% of the population believed it and continue to believe it. 60% of the population, plus or minus, believes that Saddam Hussein was an imminent threat. They got to keep repeating it to keep that level up. About half the population, about a month ago, it's probably higher now, believe that Iraq was responsible for the September 11th attack, that Iraqis were on the plains. Those beliefs turn out to be highly correlated with support for the war, and it's understandable. If you think that Saddam Hussein's an imminent threat, already destroyed the World Trade Center, planning something new, maybe a nuclear bomb, yeah, then it's understandable that you'd want to do something to get rid of him. That's a remarkable achievement of government media propaganda. You have to bear in mind that this is unique to the United States. Nowhere else where anyone believes anything like this, nor is it believed here by anybody who knows anything, like CIA or foreign policy analysts. But it has been imposed on the population. And that's impressive. It's not the first time, but it's impressive. As far as it was aimed at the election, and for the election it just barely worked. They barely managed to maintain control. Tens of thousands of votes, not much. And something similar is going to be needed for the next election. That's what Rove says this morning. It says for the next election we've got to create an image of George Bush as a powerful leader, a savior, who by then will be marching off to slay some new dragons. So it's going to be something to do next year. Well, for the guys in power, the current administration, all of this is kind of reflexive. It's just second nature. Remember that this is almost the same people who ran the country in the Reagan Bush 1 administrations. They had 12 years to do it. It's sort of astonishing when you put yourself in the position of the Martian observer again, and recognize that it's just elementary sanity, if you want to figure out what these guys are up to ask what they did during their first tenure in power. It's 12 years, not ancient history. 1981 to 92, what'd they do? Well, it's interesting that it's almost never investigated. Do a search and see how often people bring up what they did the first time around. Well, if you do it, you'll find that right now they're following almost exactly the same script. In detail. The first thing the Reaganites did when they came into office in 1981, first thing they did was drive the country into a deep deficit. Bush administration did exactly the same thing. This time, the way they did it was by a huge tax cut benefiting very tiny top percentage of the population, and by the biggest increase in federal spending in 20 years. Quoting the Wall Street Journal, but it's a fact. Biggest increase in federal spending in 20 years, that goes to the rich, huge tax cut for the rich. Well, that causes a problem, just as it did in the Reagan years. Got a deficit, you have to have what's called fiscal responsibility. Long, gloomy faces from the economic czars about fiscal responsibility. Fiscal responsibility means you got to cut services for the population. You got to cut benefits that help people. You keep the benefits to the rich. That's what the federal spending and a tax cut are about. Well, during the Reagan years, that's exactly what was done, and it was harmful. It was harmful even to economic growth, although it was some, but it was very harmful to the general population. It was 10 years of either stagnation or decline for most people. U.S. working hours went to the highest in the industrial world. For incomes either stagnated or declined, working conditions declined. This was called a welcome development of transcendent importance by the Wall Street Journal, which tells you exactly what was going on. Well, it was highly unpopular, as you can imagine. There's a lot of mythology about Reagan's popularity. It's simply untrue. In fact, at the end, by 1992, he was ranked as the most unpopular living ex-president, right next to Richard Nixon, well below Carter and Ford. Well, you know, how'd they stay in power? Pressing the panic button every year, just what they're doing now. So they started right off with, it was recognized right away that Libya is a very convenient punching bag. It's completely defenseless. Everybody hates it. You can do what you want. So they started attacking Libya right away and presenting Libya as a threat. In 1981, Reagan was hiding in the White House because he had to be protected from Libyan hitmen who were wandering around the streets of Washington, and nobody could do anything about them. They're going to kill our leader. Well, somehow he escaped. Libya was trying to expel us from the world. He said nothing less than that. 2 years later came that air base in Grenada, which the Russians were going to use to bomb us. And then there was Nicaragua, 2 days driving time from Harlingen, Texas. Remember that? They were really close. And waving copies of Mein Kampf, according to the Secretary of State. A real threat. You know. Reagan called a national emergency in 1985 to defend the country from the threat to the security of the United States posed by the government of Nicaragua. The Martian would be dying of laughter, I guess, but people here didn't laugh. In fact, if you look at that, that was renewed annually right through the 80s. You take a look at it, it's almost the same wording as the congressional resolution in October 2002 about the threat of Saddam Hussein. Imminent threat to the security of the United States. You've got to do something. In the 1980s, it meant a terrorist war against Nicaragua. Ended up with the U.S. had to defy the World Court. The Security Council continued, destroyed the country practically. The other countries even worse. In 1988, George Bush was able to get elected, George Bush #1, but only by invoking the threat of black criminal rapists, Willie Horton. You remember that? That's how he got elected. Terrified everyone. There were crime frenzies, drug frenzies, just on and on. The international policies then were the same as now. The Reagan administration came into office in 1981, declaring that a war on terror would be the focus of U.S. foreign policy. A war against depraved opponents of civilization itself and a return to barbarism in our time, on and on. And it ended up, it very quickly turned into a terrorist war. They devastated Central America, the Middle East. It was all over the world. The U.S. supported South Africa right through the 1980s. The Reagan administration had to find ways to get around congressional legislation calling sanctions. They were able to increase trade and support for South Africa right to the end. Just in the Reagan years alone, South African depredations in the surrounding countries, in Angola and Mozambique, killed about 1.5 million people. It's not small. That's when ends up with Colin Powell, the moderate, as National Security Advisor. In 1988, the U.S. declared Nelson Mandela's African National Congress to be one of the more notorious terrorist organizations in the world. That's part of the reason for supporting the South African apartheid regime. In 1987, December 1987, the U.S. voted against, that means essentially vetoed, the strongest UN resolution, General Assembly resolution, condemning terror in all its forms. It's the strongest resolution the UN has passed. U.S. voted against it. U.S. and Israel alone voted against it. The reason was it had a paragraph in it which said that though they condemn terrorism and have to do everything to stop it, nothing in this resolution prevents the people from struggling against racist and colonialist regimes or foreign military occupation. And the U.S. doesn't accept that. We don't think people have a right to struggle against racist and colonialist regimes and foreign military occupation. Racist and colonialist regimes referred to South Africa. Military occupation referred to Israel. The U.S. alone voted against it, Israel, reflexively. Accordingly, it's not reported. And it's not part of history, except that it is part of history. And it tells you a lot about what's going on. It's December 1987. Well, it continues like that. At that time, they were constrained. There was a deterrent. There's a limit on what you can do. The deterrent's gone. You go on to the national security strategy, uses September 11th as a pretext. The pretext is used by states all over the world. The Russians immediately used it as a pretext for stepping up their really vicious terrorist atrocities in Chechnya, assuming correctly they'd get U.S. endorsement for it. China did the same. Israel did the same in the occupied territories. It's all over. Also, states all over the world, from the Central Asian terrorist dictatorships that Bush backs to the more democratic countries all over the world, it was used as a pretext to discipline their own populations. We know what happened here. The Bush administration has made extraordinary claims, and they've been upheld by the courts to a large extent. They've claimed the right to imprison people, including U.S. citizens, without charge, without access to lawyers or family, and to do so indefinitely until the president declares that an emergency is over, which means executive authority. That's an astonishing claim. George Bush is supposed to have a bust of Winston Churchill on his desk that was given to him by his friend Tony Blair. Churchill had some things to say about this. You might listen to them. He said, "The power of the executive to cast a man into prison without formulating any charge known to the law and to deny him the judgment of his peers is in the highest degree odious and the foundation of all totalitarian government, whether Nazi or communist." That was that's what is being claimed and implemented by the United States. Churchill said this in 1943. Britain was in very serious straits at that time. They were under attack by the most murderous military force in history and came close to being destroyed. That's the moment at which Churchill declared that. And whatever you think about the threats to the United States, they're nothing like that. And he's right. It is in the highest degree odious and the foundation of all totalitarian government, whether Nazi or communist or Washington right now. Those are just plain facts. You know, take a look. And it's getting worse. There's a new Justice Department proposal, which is being called Patriot 2. It was secret, but it was leaked. It was leaked by somebody who didn't like it. And there have been a couple of reports about it in the press. You can actually read it. It's posted on the internet. NYU law professor Jack Balkin, who wrote about it, says the following: there is no civil right, not even the precious right of citizenship, that this administration will not abuse to secure ever greater control over American life. And if you read the proposal, he's exactly right. It even grants the Justice Department the right to take away citizenship just by inference, what they call inference, not any actual actions. They somehow infer from something they don't like that they don't like you, they can take away your citizenship. Nothing's ever been claimed like that. That goes far beyond what Churchill described as in the highest degree odious. Well, you know, whether that's implemented or not is up to us. Alan Gilbert here has a recent book which he opens by quoting James Madison, who warned about those who seize upon dangers abroad to blind your eyes to dangers at home. That rings pretty true, worth thinking about. Well, September 11th was the pretext. National Security Council security strategy was announced. Election campaign came along. The doctrine was announced, the doctrine of war against anybody you don't like, preventive war. The purpose is to establish that as a norm of behavior, what international legal scholars will call a new norm in international law. But to establish a norm, you have to do more than declare it. You have to illustrate it. You have to carry it out. You got to show that you're going to do it. Then it becomes a norm if you're a rich and powerful country, not if you're somebody else. Well, how do you do it? You got to pick a target. Target has to meet several conditions. One condition is it has to be defenseless. You got to make sure that you're going to have an overwhelming victory so you can rejoice over the destruction of people from a safe distance. Secondly, it's got to be important. So like there's no point going after, Burundi or some place like that. It's got to be a place that matters. Okay, what state satisfies those two conditions? Completely defenseless and very important. Well, that's Iraq. It's been utterly devastated by a decade of sanctions. It's the weakest country in the region, which is why it's not feared, no matter how much it's hated. Even in Kuwait and Iran, which Saddam invaded, not feared. In fact, for the last 5 years, they've been trying to reintegrate it into the regional system over strong U.S. objectives. It's the United States that fears it alone, just like it feared Nicaragua and Grenada and other demons. And it's extremely important. It has the second largest oil reserves in the world. Back as far back as 1945, the State Department described Persian Gulf oil resources as, in their words, a stupendous source of strategic power, one of the greatest material prizes in world history. Ever since then, the U.S. has been determined to control it. It's a leading principle of foreign policy. Actually, it goes back before, but it was the British before. And it's understandable. You don't give away a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. It's important to recognize that that means control, not access. The U.S. didn't need the oil. In fact, it barely needs it today. Look at intelligence projections. They're expecting to rely on more secure Atlantic Basin resources, Western Africa, Western Hemisphere. But they want to control it, just as they did after the Second World War. And there's a reason for that. If you control a stupendous source of strategic power, you control the world. That's a lever of world control. You have what planners at the time called veto power over other countries. You can also set prices and production levels within the range that you want, and you can make sure that the profits flow back into the right pockets. It is enormous. To gain control over this resource and to have probably military bases there is a tremendous achievement for world control, if that's what you're aiming at. You read counter-arguments to this, and they're worth looking at. So it's argued that it can't be true because the costs of reconstruction are going to be greater than the profits that will be made. Well, maybe that's true, maybe it isn't, but it's totally irrelevant. And the reason is because the costs of reconstruction are going to be paid by the taxpayer, by you. And the profits are going to go right into the pockets of the energy corporations. So yeah, doesn't matter how they balance out, it's just another taxpayer subsidy to the rich. Doesn't matter what the numbers are. So all the discussions are completely irrelevant. The profits will go to, Bechtel Corporation or Dick Cheney's Halliburton Empire or one thing or another, which will be chosen to what will be called rebuild Iraq at taxpayer expense. That's part of the way in which you transfer wealth and power from the population to the rich. Many ways, and that's one. Is there another way to proceed at this point? Yeah, there sure is. The United States could pay reparations to Iraq. That would be proper. Remember what it is. I mean, you know, you're not reading about it in the newspapers, but you all know it's reparations from 20 years of devastation of Iraq. First 10 years of support for Saddam Hussein, right through his worst atrocities. The guy's now in office. They didn't care about the atrocities, continued to support him, provide him with means to develop weapons of mass destruction. They even said why they were doing it. It didn't have to do with the war with Iran. It continued after Iran. The reason was because of, as George Bush #1 explained, his administration, our duty to support American exporters. That's why we had to support Saddam Hussein after the gassing of the Kurds and everything else. And then they added the usual boilerplate about Saddam Hussein being a source of stability and, you know, we can help improve the human rights situation and so on. That went right up to the day of the invasion of Kuwait. First mistake. It didn't follow orders. The other crimes were fine. Then comes the war and a decade of sanctions, which have devastated the population, civilian population, and strengthened Saddam Hussein, and furthermore made the population more dependent on him. I mean, he's a murderous tyrant, but a very efficient one. He had a very efficient food distribution system which people were dependent on to stay alive. The World Food Organization says the best, the most efficient food distribution system they know of. They say they can't duplicate it even by half. You know, monster, but an efficient monster, not the first one in history. So it forced the population to be dependent on him. It devastated the civilian society, strengthened Saddam Hussein. That's one reason why he's still there. Otherwise, he'd probably have been overthrown by now. Remember that Saddam Hussein was not the only monster who was supported by the guys now in Washington. They had quite an entourage that they'd collected. They were supporting, among others, Marcos and Duvalier and Suharto and Mobutu, who was the first foreign leader invited to the Bush White House. They loved them so much. Ceausescu, who's easily comparable to Saddam Hussein, vicious, murderous tyrant, supported up until the day he was overthrown by the people now in office. Every single one of those guys was overthrown from within. Why didn't it happen to Saddam, even though they were being supported by the United States? Why didn't it happen to Saddam Hussein? Well, you know, the Westerners who know Iraq best have been talking about this for years. You don't read about them in the American media. You can't find the names in the New York Times index. You can read them in Canada or overseas, England or elsewhere, namely the administrators of the UN so-called oil for food programs, Denis Halliday and Hans von Sponeck. Both of them resigned in protest against what they called the genocidal effect of the program, the sanctions, and the fact that they were destroying the civilian society and strengthening Saddam Hussein. And they've been pointing out for years that the way to overthrow Saddam Hussein is from within, just like every other gangster that was supported by the people now in Washington. Can't happen if you destroy the civilian society and you strengthen the dictator and you make people dependent on him. The main effect of the sanctions hasn't harmed Saddam Hussein and strengthened him, but it's kept him from being overthrown. Otherwise, chances are he would have gone the way of Ceausescu and the rest of them a long time ago. But an internal revolt is unacceptable to the United States, just as Saddam's leaving Iraq is unacceptable, as they announced at the summit meeting. The reason is very simple. It doesn't leave the United States in charge. It leaves the Iraqi people in charge, and that's no good. At the Azores summit, Bush and Blair announced it explicitly. They said, even if Saddam Hussein goes, we're going to invade anyway, because we have to impose the regime of our choice, not the choice of the Iraqis, whatever that might be. That's critical. Well, that gives you some tasks for people here. One is to ensure the least harmful outcomes, whatever can be done. Another is to try to get to the point where we can provide reparations to Iraqis, and if we can't get to that level of honesty, at least to provide aid that they can use to rebuild the society the way they want to, and not the way somebody in Crawford tells them to. The next task after that, and Karl Rove just told you this morning what it is, as if you didn't know, was to face the next challenge as the new norm in international relations is put into effect somewhere else. And now that it's been established by this action, you want to know what it is? A couple of days ago, James Woolsey, who was former head of the CIA under Clinton and apparently is going to get a position in the new administration, he gave a speech where I'm going to be tomorrow, in Los Angeles, where he informed the crowd cheerfully that we're now in the midst of World War IV. There's World War I, World War II, Cold War was World War III, now we're in World War IV, and we got to go over the countries that have been attacking us. He named two. He said Iran and Syria, fascist regimes of Iran and Syria have been attacking us, and we finally realized it. So now we have to go after them. So maybe they'll be the next ones. Or another possibility is the Andean region, which is now surrounded by U.S. military bases, plenty of soldiers there, and it's a big energy-producing and other resource-producing region, and it's kind of out of control. So that's a possible target, and you can think of others. But you can be pretty confident that one or another is going to come along. There's no other way to continue with the strategy that's announced and they intend to implement. Remember, these are people who barely hold political power by a hair, and the only way they can hold on to it is by terrifying the population. That means there are things that can be done. People don't have to be terrified by imaginary demons. That's an educational and organizational task, one that's not easy, but certainly within the means of people who are concerned. Well, let's go back to last September. Right after it comes October, Congress declares that Saddam Hussein is a threat to our existence, like Nicaragua, and authorizes the government to use force. Something else happened in October, something extremely important. There was a meeting, a retrospective meeting in Havana, 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The people who attended were key participants in the October 1962 missile crisis from Russia, the United States, and Cuba. And there was a discovery that actually shattered them there. It turned out that the world they knew it was a very dangerous moment. Arthur Schlesinger described it as the most dangerous moment in history, which isn't an exaggeration. But they found out last October just how dangerous it was. It turned out that the world was literally one word away from probably terminal nuclear war. It turns out that Russian submarines were under attack by U.S. destroyers. They had nuclear-armed missiles. Two of the commanders assumed that there was a global war going on and called for the missiles to be sent off. If that had happened, there would have been a massive response by the United States, wiped out half of Russia. They would have responded out and wiped out the rest of us, and we wouldn't be here to talk about it. But why didn't it happen? One submarine commander countermanded the order. The Russian rules required 3 commanders to authorize nuclear weapons. 2 agreed and 1 refused. That's why we're here. That's how close it was. This is after a campaign of international terrorism that led to the crisis, aimed at regime change for the kind of reasons I mentioned, all very much in the news last October, very imminent, barely reported. I don't know how many of you know about it. It was barely mentioned. Who cares if the world was one word away from nuclear war after a U.S. campaign of international terrorism? What followed was an increase in the terrorism and Dean Acheson's explanation, which I already read to you. Well, there are more important things than survival, like profits and power. That's what we learn from this. Immediately after this discovery, barely reported, a week later, October 23rd, there was a meeting of the United Nations Disarmament Commission, that's essentially the General Assembly. They passed 2 extremely important resolutions. One of them reaffirmed a 1925 treaty that bans biological weapons. The second was a resolution that extended a 1967 treaty banning the use of banning the militarization of space, preserving space for peaceful uses. Well, why those weren't reported? Those resolutions. Had a friend do a database check. Weren't reported. Why? The United States voted against them alone. The United States and reflexively Israel voted against reaffirming a 1925 ban on biological weapons and a 1967 treaty, now extended, to ban militarization of space. Well, that's really dangerous, both of them, and very urgent. Shortly after, but not reported. Right after that, the U.S., the Bush administration killed a bioweapons treaty that was under negotiation, stunning the Europeans. Last minute, the U.S. stepped in and says, no, we're not going to allow any discussion of enforcement mechanisms for years. The reason, got to protect the secrets of U.S. pharmaceutical corporations. It's much more important than banning biological weapons. Probably there's another reason. It's very likely that the United States is carrying out illegal tests of development of biological weapons. A lot of scientists guess that that's the reason why they claim that they haven't been able to find the source of the anthrax attack. It was traced back to a U.S. federal laboratory, remember. This is not like disarming Iraq. It's a U.S. federal laboratory. They claim not to be able to find the source. It's kind of hard to believe. But it may be, and it's been speculated by the Federation of American Scientists and others, that probable reason is that they're concealing some kind of weapons development program that they don't want exposed. Well, maybe not. We ought to find out about it. Right after that, the U.S. went on to infuriate even its closest allies in the World Trade Organization. First of all, by taking a very extreme stand violating trade rules. Notice that that's another reiteration that's still following the script of the Reagan years. There's a lot of talk about free trade, but they were the strongest opponents of free trade in the industrial world. In fact, the Reagan administration was the most protectionist government in post-war U.S. history. They virtually doubled protectionist barriers in the United States. The GATT, which is the predecessor of the World Trade Organization, according to their analysis, Reaganite protectionist measures were 3 times as high as other industrial countries, very damaging to world trade, but the most powerful state in the world does what it wants, and they're doing it right again. The Bush administration has broken some new barriers and protectionist measures, but much worse than that, and this really did amaze and infuriate Europe and others, is just a couple of weeks ago the U.S. intervened to prevent efforts which had been agreed to by the other industrial powers, efforts to provide inexpensive drugs to people who are dying of treatable diseases, AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, and others. That's tens of millions of people who are dying from these diseases, and the U.S. intervened to prevent access to inexpensive drugs, again because huge profits for heavily subsidized U.S. pharmaceutical corporations are a much higher priority. It doesn't make you popular. The U.S. also continued to and is continuing to undermine international efforts to reduce threats to the environment, which are by now universally recognized to be severe and maybe a threat to survival. The pretext for this barely conceal service to pretty narrow sectors of private power. If you take a look at the journal Science, the journal of the American Association for Advancement of Science, the lead editorial about a week ago was a bitter condemnation of the Bush administration climate change science plan, which does absolutely nothing. It does nothing to stop what just about every scientist who pays attention recognizes to be a very severe threat. Well, again, profits are more important. All of this engenders fear and hatred of the leadership, and maybe ultimately hatred of the society, which was regarded as just too dangerous. That's going to lead to efforts at deterrence. How do you deter a country which has overwhelming military power? Well, you know, every international affairs specialist can tell you, and does tell you, by proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and proliferation of terror. That's what the Bush administration is going to achieve. As I say, Osama bin Laden must be cheering somewhere. Well, go back to that intelligent Martian. If he has some concern for the human species, he might be watching all of this with some amazement and asking how long it can be that people who live in a free country are going to allow it to go on. Thanks. I'm told that there are a couple of mics around, so if you'd like to go to them and we can turn this into a discussion. You start? Okay.
Hi, Noam. I wanted to ask about if we accept, and as I think we should, this sort of call to action as privileged citizens, what your estimation would be of two possible actions we can work for within the kind of narrow political spectrum. You've talked tonight about the what was done by this administration and by some of the same people during Reagan, Bush, and you've also criticized Clinton, but not so much tonight. And I'm wondering how important it would be to try to work for the change from the Republicans to the Democrats in the next election, which is, you know, it's a measurable change, versus other possible political activities like, you know, campaign finance reform and that kind of thing.
Well, it depends what the Democrats are. So I didn't talk much. I actually did talk about Clinton. So the sanctions that have destroyed Iraq and strengthened Saddam Hussein and made the population dependent on him and prevented an internal revolt, that's Clinton.
Right.
Okay, and there's plenty more. Take another example, which is often another domain. Take a look at Brazil. It's very interesting. It's informative what's happening there. Very informative. Brazil has a huge popular movement, left popular movement, nothing like here. They succeed, and they're very effective. The Landless Workers Movement, the Workers' Party, and others, the biggest popular movements in the world and the most effective. They managed to elect their own president. Pretty impressive guy. Now, just take a look at what's happening and think a little about history. There's a good reason why nobody studies history. It just teaches you too much. But take a look at recent history. 40 years ago, Brazil had a populist president. It was during the Kennedy administration, not like Lula, but, you know, mildly populist president. Kennedy administration didn't like him. They organized a military coup to overthrow him. It happened to take place shortly after the assassination, but had already been prepared by the Kennedy administration. It was hailed by Kennedy's ambassador as the greatest victory for freedom in the mid-20th century, while the generals were torturing and murdering. It imposed the first kind of neo-Nazi national security state in Latin America. That's the beginning of a plague that spread right through the hemisphere, ended up in Central America in the 80s. It's pretty awful. We ought to know all about it. This time, they're not calling for a military coup, although Lula's a much more threatening leader for them and has a mass popular support, organized support that Goulart back in those days didn't have. How come? Well, there's two basic reasons. For one thing, the activism of the last 40 years has changed this country as well as Brazil. People here wouldn't accept it anymore. Then nobody cared. Nobody knew, pay any attention. But a lot has been done in the last 40 years. It's a much more civilized country. It'd be very hard to carry that off now. There's a second reason. Here comes Clinton. They don't need it. Back in the 1960s, the only way you could prevent a populist movement was a military coup. Now you can do it by the mechanisms of what the world calls neoliberalism. Financial markets, the international financial markets can strangle them. Capital can flow out of the country. What's called by economists a virtual parliament of investors and lenders can make the actual decisions over what happens in a country. Its own voters are irrelevant. The virtual parliament does it. Yeah, that's thanks to the what's called globalization. The measures that have been introduced in the last 30 years, primarily, much of it under Clinton, which means that, so like when Lula went to Davos at the World Economic Forum and made a good speech about how we have to, work on overcoming poverty and all kind of nice things, they cheered him. They thought, oh, that's nice, because they know he can't do a damn thing. Because the minute he makes a move, the virtual parliament will strangle him. Okay, a lot of that is thanks to Clinton. Those are other ways of controlling people. I mean, they might have alternatives, but they'd have to be almost revolutionary by now. That's what the global justice movements are about, trying to prevent the virtual parliament from destroying what's left of democracy by transferring power into the hands of the virtual parliament. Okay, we ought to know about those things too, and plenty of people do. That's why there's a big global justice movement. That's Clinton too, and there's more. Going back to your question, it's really hard to say. It depends what the alternatives actually are. That's why I was quoting Dean Acheson, Kennedy administration, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the planning commissions in 1940. Okay, the spectrum is pretty narrow. It's not to say that it doesn't exist. And sometimes choices within it are important. But far more important than that is changing the spectrum. And the way you do that is by the kinds of activism that have changed the country. That changes the spectrum within which choices are going to be made. Ultimately, you want to go beyond that. But for the short term, that's, I think, what has to be done.
Given that our government is the most powerful government in the world right now, how could we best utilize that power to affect change, both in terms of pertinent issues like nuclear proliferation and in terms of changing human rights? And I guess most immediately I'm thinking about where do we go from where we are now with North Korea, given that we've already made the mistakes that we have in the past?
Well, first of all, I think the way to deal with the overwhelming military power of the United States is to dismantle it, not to use it. It's a threat. So take, say, nuclear proliferation. Okay, that's dangerous. In fact, nuclear weapons are among the most likely things that will do us in. It's pretty close. Came very close in '62, and that's not the only time. What do you do about nuclear proliferation? Well, there is a treaty. It's called the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which obligates the nuclear states, that includes us, to carry out good faith efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons. Okay? And nobody follows that, and nobody's going to follow it unless the United States takes the lead. The United States is one of the main violators of the treaty. It's right through Clinton, incidentally. And one way to reduce the threat of nuclear weapons is to observe the provisions of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Another way to do it is to pay attention to the Security Council declarations that are selectively used to justify the war on Iraq. They don't only call for disarmament of Iraq. They call for, there's a paragraph which is very rarely quoted, which calls for disarmament of Iraq as a step towards elimination of weapons of mass destruction and delivery systems in the region. Okay, that's specifically referring to the U.S. offshore military base in Israel, which has hundreds of nuclear weapons and totally overwhelms anyone in the region in military force. That's what they're talking about. That's another step. Another way to do it is to follow the recommendations of the high-level congressional and other committees, which have pointed out that the major threat of nuclear weapons right now, at least, is what they call loose nukes. You know, Russia or Pakistan or somebody with nuclear weapons, tens of thousands of them, in fact, that are kind of getting out of control. Well, you know, there are small programs to try to do something about that, and they're but they ought to be huge programs. So there are many problems about nuclear weapons, and another thing to do is to stop encouraging countries to develop nuclear power, which is what they're going to do. All right, let's get to North Korea. I don't know what you're calling mistakes exactly, but the countries of the region have an approach that they want to follow. And we should be following their lead, I think. South Korea in the lead, and Japan and China basically agree with them, that this is a serious problem, very serious problem, and it has to be dealt with through diplomacy and through moves to somehow integrate North Korea back into the system, which is not a trivial matter. The framework agreement, this is one thing that Clinton did which was right, of 1994, if it had been implemented, would have taken steps, it was taking steps towards that. Well, it's been reversed. And we ought to go back and we ought to follow the lead of the South Koreans on this. It's dangerous. Right now, the danger of North Korea is not nuclear weapons. The danger is, the reason why the U.S. isn't attacking North Korea is because they have a deterrent. The deterrent is conventional weapons, massed artillery, which can destroy Seoul in 5 minutes. You know, I'm sure that at the Pentagon they're working on techniques for, precision-guided weapons that can somehow, maybe tactical nuclear weapons that can somehow take out that artillery. But until they can do that, they can't attack North Korea because it has a deterrent. And in fact, the U.S. is teaching the world a very ugly lesson now. It's telling the world, if you want to prevent us from attacking you, you better have a deterrent. If you're defenseless like Iraq, we'll go after you. If you're North Korea, which is a much worse tyranny and a much greater threat, but you have a deterrent, we're not going to go after you. It may not be the headlines here, but everybody in the world understands it. It's very evident. That's really bad. Behind that, there are other things going on. So you take a look at that region, Siberia, China, Japan, Korea. It's an integrated region. It has tremendous resources, mostly in Siberia, like energy resources. It has countries that need those resources, Japan, China, South Korea. The natural development, and one that's beginning to take place, is some kind of integration in which the energy and other material resources of Siberia are going to be used by the surrounding countries which are carrying out industrial development. The U.S. is very much opposed to that, does not want an integrated region to develop that will be out of control of U.S. global power. That's part of the background for what's going on in the Gulf, in fact. So yeah, that's in the works. There's a lot to be concerned about if you're really thinking about the future. North Korea is a threat, and the way to deal with it is by following the lead of the people who are right there, like South Korea and the other countries. And we can do a lot to reduce the threat of nuclear weapons by following our own treaty obligations. That'd be a good start.
Even radical extreme statists such as Bush and Company must share a basic sense of self-preservation along with the rest of us. But it seems to me that they too, at a very personal level, will suffer the likely consequences of their own actions, a dangerous course that they've initiated. Do these people believe that they'll escape by magic or by divine intervention,
Yeah.
Or does their extreme devotion to ideology prevent ordinary logical thinking?
It's logical.
And finally, is it important for us or not to understand what's going on in their minds if we want to change the world?
No, I don't think it's minor importance. The reason it's of minor importance is that this is close to a historical universal. You know, it happens that by now the stakes are much greater because the means of violence are so much greater. You take a look at history, it's been like this forever. You take a look at the history of war. I mean, very often, maybe like half the time, wars were started by countries who got destroyed. Well, they're willing to, the leadership was willing to take the chance, you know. I mean, and it's not just recent. You know, people talk about the 20th century as the most horrible century ever, and in some ways it was. But you look at the wars in Europe, the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, it wiped out about 40% of the population of Germany. They kept at it. You know, the leadership was just more important. Or take a look at, take more recent times. Go back to 1950, okay? There was one potential threat to U.S. security. No nearby. I mean, the U.S. had enormous security. You know, controlled the Western Hemisphere, controlled both oceans, controlled the other sides of both oceans. There'd never been as secure a country, but there was a potential threat. The potential threat was only potential then, was intercontinental missiles with thermonuclear warheads. Okay? If anybody had been concerned with the security of the United States, they would have tried to avert the development of that technology. And very likely the Russians would have agreed. And not because they're nice guys, but because they were so far behind, they didn't want the technology developed. McGeorge Bundy, who was Kennedy's national security advisor, wrote the authoritative history of all of this and had access to, you know, all the internal documents and so on. He points out in his history that he cannot find any document which suggests that anybody even thought about it. You know, that they even had a plan or a thought about trying to avert the threat, the only serious threat to the survival of the United States. And the reason is you just don't think about that. You're interested in short-term power, profit, and gain, and the fact that it might destroy your country is kind of secondary. And that goes right through history, you know, except the main difference now is that the stakes are much higher, much higher. But the reasoning is pretty constant. So is it important to think what's in the minds of these particular guys? Yeah, maybe at some level, but it's more important to recognize that, you know, within a lunatic framework, decisions are made which are pretty rational. It's the framework that's lunatic. I mean, you could say the same about environmental destruction. You know, you don't know how far off it is, and nobody knows exactly what will happen, but by now it's universally recognized that it's extremely dangerous, and that the system, in fact, is kind of nonlinear. That is, a small change might lead to a huge effect, and so on. It could happen any time. That's known. Is anybody doing anything about it? No, because it's much more important to have short-term profit. Well, within us, and in fact, if you think about what you're taught in your economics courses, that's right. You know, it's rational within a framework of thinking that's pretty much accepted. People are supposed to be rational wealth maximizers, right? You're trying to maximize your own wealth. Okay, that's what you're supposed to be if you're rational. Well, and the market, if it works perfectly in theory, is supposed to respond to the inputs from the participants. So your votes are your dollars, and your goal is maximizing your wealth. Okay, here's a simple question. How many votes do your grandchildren have in the market? None. You know, they don't vote in the market. Therefore, their interests are valued at zero in what's called rational behavior. So therefore, it's entirely rational to destroy the possibility that of a world in which they can survive if you can have more shoes. You know, it's essentially what it comes down to. It's a kind of a rational decision within a framework of complete lunacy, you know. And there's a lot in history that's like that. We should be concerned with those lunatic frameworks much more than what's in the mind of some person who's making decisions within them that may be pretty rational within a accepted framework. That's really important, I think.
Mr. Chomsky?
Is there somebody up there? I can't really see.
Thank you. If you had to excuse me, a little feedback.
Could you wave an arm or something? I can't see.
If you had to recommend 4 or 5 publications that you think provide unbiased and accurate reporting, what would you recommend?
Outside of KGNU, you mean? I don't want to sound dismissive, but I really think it's the wrong question. Nothing is unbiased. Everything is presented from a certain point of view. If you're honest, you make your point of view clear. If you're dishonest, you pretend you're objective, and so on and so forth. And then it's really up to you to decide what you think is telling something that sounds reasonable to you. And you really ought to be triangulating. You look at different things and see how the world looks from different points of view, and then you make your own decisions. It's just as if you're a chemist working on some problem in chemistry. There is nothing that gives you an unbiased point of view. It takes work, and it's a lot harder when you are trying to deal with human affairs. So, I mean, I know what I think is important, but it's really up to you to decide what you think is important. I mean, for example, I learn a lot by reading the Wall Street Journal. That's why I was quoting it. I mean, I can't stand what, we disagree on every imaginable topic. But if you read it, you can learn a lot about, first of all, what's happening, because they have pretty honest reporting. Remember, they're reporting for the business world, which has to have a semi-realistic picture of what the world is like. And you also learn what's being thought about in centers of power. That's important. I don't say that's the only thing you should read. I mean, I think you should read Z Magazine too, but from then on you've got to decide yourself.
I'm next.
You're next,
Yeah.
okay. I lost track.
And I'm not going to miss this opportunity. I've been waiting for a long time. You mentioned that the next region that it's going to be in the eyes of the United States.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
You mentioned that the next region could be the Andean region. That's, the United States is going to go propagate the democracy and freedoms that we...
Like we've done in Latin America for a century, yeah.
I would like you to give us Bolivia in the last 5 years, and I'm a Bolivian. I was born in Bolivia, but I'm a U.S. citizen now. Bolivia in the last 5 years has discovered quite a bit of natural gas, and it's probably that in the next 5 years we will get close to the U.S. and reserves in the American continent. And there's quite a bit of opposition about a project that has been taking place. The government is trying to implement a project that is called Pacific LNG, liquefying Bolivian natural gas and exporting it to Southern California. There's quite a bit of opposition about that project from local people because it doesn't benefit, it's not going to benefit Bolivia in any way. If you know anything about that, if you could give us a little bit more details. Mm-hmm. And also I have a request from a lot of civic and organizations in Bolivia to invite you down there to give us an idea about the devastating consequences of the American free trade that the U.S. government is trying to propagate all over South America.
Well, I mean, you probably know more about Bolivian resources than I do, so I won't answer, but I doubt that the resources are on that scale. I think they're significant, but I doubt that they're on the North American scale. However, it is true that there are intelligence projections. A document you ought to read, it's public, it's called, I forget the name, Global... It's in the year 2000, the National Intelligence Community, that's the CIA and the rest of them, published a projection for the next 15 years. If you want a reference to it, send me an email. It's got a website. Or you can get it under the CIA website if you look. And it's a long, detailed projection of what they expect in the next 15 years, and it's pretty interesting. Parts of it have to do with this. They describe the Andean region. They don't mention Bolivia, well, except that insofar as it's part of this region at the periphery. But the Andean region, they say they expect to be one of the main sources on which the U.S. will rely for its energy requirements. Not the only one, but one. That's why I mentioned that it's a possible target, aside from the fact that it's out of control. Bolivia, as you know, is almost out of control. It came very close to electing a populist president, and would have if it hadn't been for violence. There's a lot of opposition in Bolivia to the so-called drug war, which doesn't have a lot to do with drugs, but it has a lot to do with driving people off the land and things like that. And it's been a disaster in Bolivia for the population for almost 20 years now. Alternative development programs that have been talked about haven't been realized, as they haven't been anywhere else, and it's pretty bad news. And so, you know, a lot of tension and violence. The U.S., as I mentioned, has military bases all over the region, and undoubtedly is looking for, you know, there are plans to go further, including Bolivia. As to the free trade agreements, well, you know, there's one region where they've been implemented, North America, okay, Canada, United States, and Mexico, and that's NAFTA. It's opposed by the populations in all three countries. It was implemented over the objections of the populations of all three countries. It's one of Clinton's other achievements. It required a tremendous media campaign to prevent people from knowing about what was happening. I mean, to this day, 10 years later, the official position of the labor movement has not been allowed expression, right? There's a lot of denunciation of the labor movement, but their own position, which was pretty reasonable, wasn't allowed expression, still isn't. But the population is still opposed. Back in at the Hemispheric Summit in, what was it, April 2001 in Quebec, that was supposed to be the summit that was going to establish the free trade agreement for the Americas. Okay, and they were going to, and NAFTA was the model. Everyone read the headlines. It's all about how magnificent NAFTA was. Now we have to extend the benefits to the hemisphere. Well, here's another propaganda achievement for you. The two major organizations, pretty well-known organizations, the leading human rights group in the world, Human Rights Watch, and the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, which is one of the major, you know, think tanks that does regular economic analysis. Both of them published major documents on NAFTA timed for release at the summit. Human Rights Watch their document dealt with effects of NAFTA on labor rights in the three countries. The Economic Policy Institute document had experts from the three countries discussing in detail the effects on working people of NAFTA in the three countries. Had a friend do a database search on that. It wasn't mentioned in the United States, except for one op-ed in a small town newspaper. Well, why? Because Human Rights Watch concluded that NAFTA had been harmful to labor rights in all three countries, mostly Mexico, which is the most vulnerable. And the Economic Policy Institute give a detailed analysis in which they concluded that it's one of those rare agreements which had been harmful to working people, which means the majority of the population in all three countries, most harmful in Mexico, which is the most vulnerable. And you don't want people to know that when the headlines are talking about how marvelous NAFTA is and how we have to extend it to the hemisphere. But if you read those reports, you get a pretty good assessment of what the effect of so-called free trade is. And it's not free trade. That's propaganda. It's a very special form of international integration which gives rights to investors, not to people. So under, say, NAFTA, one of the provisions of NAFTA, like the World Trade Organization, is that corporations are permitted to claim national rights. So GM can go to Mexico and claim the rights of Mexican businesses. What happens if a Mexican of flesh and blood that tries to go to New York and claim the rights of an American person of flesh and blood? You know, don't have to bother asking. That's just only one example of special rights that are given to private tyrannies that people don't have. When NAFTA was passed, it was implemented in 1994. There was another legislation implemented in 1994 by the Clinton administration. It was called Operation Gatekeeper. It militarized the U.S.-Mexican border. That's an artificial border, like most borders. It was established by conquest. The United States conquered half of Mexico. And the border has been pretty porous in both directions. Same people live on both sides. They've been moving up and back. Clinton understood that when NAFTA is passed, you have to block the movement of people, okay? Free trade, if you go back to Adam Smith, is based on free movement of people. But you have to stop that. And the reason is because they anticipated an economic disaster in Mexico that they were going to call an economic miracle. And it was going to mean there would be a flood of people from Mexico fleeing to the United States. And they got to block that, so they militarized the border. And hundreds of Mexicans have been killed since then trying to cross the border. It's one of the effects of NAFTA. These are not free trade agreements. They're agreements which provide, which are carefully calibrated to be a mixture of protectionism and liberalization designed for the interests of those who are designing them. That's not very surprising. The people who are designing them, mainly corporate sector, are designing them in their interest. It includes very highly protectionist measures and the kind of liberalization that will benefit them. But they're not free trade agreements, and NAFTA, at least, appears to have been harmful to the majority of the population in all three countries. There's no particular reason to think that if you extend it to the hemisphere, it's going to be any different.
Before I leave, I have to convey the message of some of the people that wanted to invite you there. And I know you're booked for the next 2 years or 3 years, but can I contact you somehow, and maybe we can discuss if you could do something, because they want to have you there, and they want to listen.
In Bolivia?
In Bolivia.
Yeah, I have one of my many thick files of invitations is from friends in Bolivia.
How can I contact you?
You can just email me, but all I can do is add it to the file.
Okay, where do I get your email on the web?
It's the obvious one. Just my name, Chomsky, at MIT.edu, educational institutions. So just what you'd guess.
Thank you. I'll do that. Thanks.
Okay.
What's to prevent?
But I have to tell you that I'll probably have to send a form response. I mean, I get hundreds a day, and even spending 4 or 5 hours a night, I can't really respond.
We'll keep at it.
But so a lot of them have to say, if it's an invitation, just all I can do is file it.
What's to prevent Mr. Bush from carrying out a plan, which I believe is part of his national emergency policy, and that is to cancel the 2004 elections?
I think, these guys are pretty bad, but I don't think that's in the cards. I think that probably would lead to a rebellion in the country. Unless, with an exception, if some major terrorist action takes place, all bets are off. And I don't say that they're trying to stimulate one, but the policies that they are pursuing are increasing the likelihood of terrorist operations, and they know it. They read their own intelligence reports. They read CIA reports. They read what strategic analysts are saying. And they're almost uniform in saying that the policies that are being pursued are likely to increase the threat of terrorism. And the threat is severe. You want to know how severe it is? I recommend some reading. There's a high-level task force, Hart-Rudman task force, organized by the Council on Foreign Relations, which just came out with its report a couple of months ago on some title like Terrorist Threats to the United States. Like everyone else, they said the threats are going to be increased by the attack on Iraq. Everybody says that. But the threat, then they run through it's kind of like a cookbook for terrorists. It has a series of threats which I hadn't even thought of, and they're very extreme. So, for example, they point out, and they apparently unstoppable. I forget the numbers, but they point out that a huge number of containers, most of what comes into the country is in containers, container ships, I think it's tens of millions a year, some extremely high number. And those containers are uninspected. Okay, anything could be in them. Furthermore, there's no way to inspect them. They come from 3 or 4 places around the world, Singapore, Amsterdam, or maybe Rotterdam, and some other place. And if you tried to inspect them, you would back up commerce, for months. Trucks clogging all of Europe, waiting to be inspected. I mean, the whole economic system would collapse, especially if it's based on on-time production. So there doesn't seem to be any feasible way to inspect them. Any one of them could have a nuclear weapon in it, be put together in some, New York hotel room. And it goes on with threats like this. I mean, if you're going to try to create a world where people want to destroy you, they got a lot of ways of doing it. And if a terrorist attack takes place, I think all bets are off. This is a very frightened country anyway, and if anything happens, it could go berserk.
Do you consider
I don't.
tax resistance by Americans to be an appropriate means of expressing dissent and possibly affecting transformation in the government?
Well, I mean, I was a tax resistor myself for a long time. And in fact, I tried to organize national tax resistance back in 1965 with a couple of friends. We really tried hard, didn't get very far. And I myself kept at it for about 10 years until I realized it's just not an effective tactic at that point. These are tactical questions. You have to try to judge, is it going to reach people? If you carry out any form of civil disobedience, whether it's tax resistance or something else, you have to ask, what are the likely consequences? I mean, you're not making a pact with God. You're trying to have an effect, Say, well, what are the consequences going to be? Is it going to encourage other people to do something, say, because they'll see you're doing this? And right now, my own I don't have any faith in my tactical judgment. Yours is better than mine, I'm sure. But if you want mine, it's that it's probably not an effective device now. Frankly, I think the most important thing now is to do something about the fact that this country is so terrified that an unscrupulous leader can impose lunatic ideas by a propaganda campaign that lead to real dangers. It seems to me that's what we ought to be dealing with. We ought to also be dealing with the fact that really critical and important things are just not reaching people, like what happened last October, say. Those of extraordinary importance, just one example. Unless that stuff is known to people, you're not going to be able to organize and have an effect. And that means breaking through media monopolies, information control, indoctrination, all sorts of things. Dealing with that seems to me a lot more important than things like tax resistance right now. But it's your guess.
Thanks. I really appreciate your coming, and I hope to see you back in the area soon. But my question was very similar to hers, actually. But I wanted to know your opinion, given all the recent events of the past few years worldwide, the opposition to some of the decisions the Bush administration has made, the WTO violations. If this invasion in Iraq continues and becomes drawn out, and you can just go on to imagine what could happen next, you don't think there's any chance for an international crimes court to bring charges against officials under the Bush administration?
At this point in time, virtually none, because the U.S. is just too powerful, and there isn't enough internal opposition. Frankly, I'm amazed that the war's going on this long. I thought it would be over in 2 days, if you look at the relations of means of violence, and I still suspect it's going to end very quickly. But if it does drag on, there's going to be enormous protests, and there could be all sorts of things happening. I mean, right now there's tremendous anger and hatred all over the world, and it's probably going to manifest itself in action. But I don't think an international criminal court is in the cards, and it doesn't seem to me it's our concern, really. Our concern is to change this country. not to speculate about what somebody else is going to do.
Thank you.
I'm afraid this has got to be the last question, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. Yeah, really, thank you.
Name and where are you from? Yeah, you can.
Okay, all right. I'm Joy Barrett, and I'm from Boulder.
And what brought you here this evening to hear Noam Chomsky?
Because I've been a fan of Noam Chomsky's for the 20 or so years that I've been paying attention to international events, and I came to be educated and inspired. And also, I take great comfort in being, in these troubled times, surrounded by people who care about these issues. So it was a really good gathering in that sense.
And what was the night for you, information-wise? Was there anything in particular that surprised you or struck you about the evening? Again, or maybe we can add to that, information-wise or community-wise.
Community-wise, I was pretty on top of the things that happen. I've worked with KGNU for a very long time. For most of it's 25 years. So there weren't a lot of surprises. Some of the facts that Professor Chomsky stated were new to me, and I can use them for ammunition in debates with people. And also some of the questions, the issues that came up in the questions, like U.S. government being so ludicrous as to decide that they would invade the Netherlands if the International Criminal Court ever tried to try someone from the U.S. That just shows the extent that these guys are out of touch with reality and will also go to great lengths to make sure that they consolidate power, that they maintain power. Issues that scared me the most are, well, Professor Chomsky reinforced my fears that I had back throughout the 80s and the 70s, but let go of a little bit in the 90s, that ultimately we may all end in nuclear annihilation. That is so real a threat. And so where to go with that is just to work even harder to try and keep that from happening. His main message tonight to me was change has to happen here, and we have to become a true democracy, an active democracy, an educated and informed populace. And so, as I said earlier today in a rally where I gave a talk, our task is huge. It's to educate people with the truth. There are good people in this country, but they haven't got information, and that's what our job is. So I came here to get some tools to go out and educate people and get them to make better decisions democratically.
Thank you so much. And was there anything in particular about this evening that particularly struck you?
I'm always taken by the clarity of what Chomsky has to say. You know, he makes things very understandable, and he just says it in such a way that it's not antagonistic. You know, he doesn't throw it at you. He just gives it to you in a way that you can digest it.
And is there anything in particular that you see yourself inspired to do that you haven't been doing as a result of being here tonight? You can be honest.
Yeah, well, I'm always inspired to try to do more. You know, I've written letters and I've made phone calls. It's confusing. I mean, frankly, it's really confusing. It's hard. The problem is so overwhelming that it's hard to know which direction to turn. What you guys are doing, I think, is a big plus. Free Speech TV. I always kind of gravitate towards the fact that we're not getting the information. We're not getting this. We're not getting it on the media. We're not getting it on the radio, on the TV. And I really think that if you could break that barrier, if you could get venues out there that 90% of the people don't get to see, that, you know, what would happen would be exactly what we were told would happen. Public opinion would change, people would become more educated, and they would take matters into their own hands, and the government wouldn't be able to get away with what they're getting away with. So, as far as me being inspired, yeah, I'm always inspired. But it's a hard road. It's hard to know what's first.
And And what brought you here this evening?
Tonight I came to see Noam Chomsky speak to citizens of Boulder because I think that he shares my ideals and values. And in this time, we've been at war for about 12 days now, and lately I've been feeling demoralized and sad, and I'm losing hope. And hearing a strong voice of Noam Chomsky really makes me to feel like there are people in the world who believe in peace just like I do, and facts to back that up, and that makes me feel comforted in this difficult time.
And as if that's enough, is there anything in particular that you feel you're going to take from this evening and bring out into the world or bring into your personal life?
Well, just being surrounded by about 2,000 people who live in Boulder and support the ideas that Noam Chomsky stands for. It's really a wonderful experience tonight, and so I'm going to go home remembering that I'm surrounded by people in this community who share my values, and that gives me a lot of hope.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Abir.
Sure.